Geldin. Sektörün önemli isimlerini sahnemizde ağırlamaya devam ediyoruz. Şimdi de sırada tasarımları ve sorumlu üretim anlayışıyla ön plana çıkan Language of Birds markasının kurucusu ve aynı zamanda yayınladığı craft kitaplarıyla da adından çokça söz ettiren Tsia Carson alkışlarınızla sahnede. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Tsia Carson. I run a small apparel firm called Language of the Birds, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about sustainability at a very small scale in textile design. My Turkish is terrible, so merhaba. I flew in from New York, so I am a little bit jet-lagged, but I'll do my best to keep us all on focus here. So, sustainability is a fluid concept that encompasses a host of concerns. I've arranged this so that we have a map of where we're going. Right now we're going to talk about global issues, macro-environmental issues that have to do with sustainability in textile design. Let's begin with some sobering figures, although most of you probably know these already, being sort of at the heart of the industry. And let me stop for a minute and say that, because I didn't manage to do this at the beginning, I'm really happy to be here. Turkish textiles are recognized globally as being of the best quality, and the relationships that you've made, at least that I know about in the US, are excellent in terms of communication, quality, all of that stuff. So anyway, let's get to the terrible scenarios. 20% of industrial water pollution globally is attributable to the dyeing and treatment of textiles, 1/5. So this is a huge number. This is a very small number. 1%, less than 1% of material used to produce clothing is recycled into new clothing. So if we look at the global material flows for clothing in 2015, it's not a great chart. You can see that 73% of those materials goes to incineration or landfill. 14% goes to loss. That's in the production of textiles or in the production of apparel. And 12% goes to cascaded recycling, which means that clothes are turned into, like downcycled into things such as mattress filling, insulation, etc. And then there's that like 1%, less than 1% closed loop recycling, which means that the clothes then get made into new clothes again. So if the industry continues on its current path, by 2050, it could use more than 1/4 of the carbon budget associated with a 2 degrees Celsius pathway. So the urgency driving sustainability is pretty clear and pretty pressing. Now here's something very interesting. 40% of US consumers will be under the age of 27 by 2020. What are the ramifications of this generational shift? Guess what these large US brands and retailers have in common? Some of which I'm sure you're familiar with, some of which maybe we only know about in the US, but all of these are rather large operations with many, many retail outlets and a huge sort of physical footprint. Topshop, Forever 21, Barney's New York, Diesel, Gymboree, Payless Shoes, Charlotte Russe, sort of across the retail apparel sector. They all declared bankruptcy this year. So there's a seismic generational shift underway, and with it, I think, and I don't think I'm crazy, new consumer trends. So let's take a look at those for a second. This is where we are now. Look, we went from the terrible figures, the macro issues, and now we're at consumer trends. Much more fun. First trend up that I'd like to talk about is slow fashion, which is something I practice with my apparel brand. These are clothes that are made using ethical, socially conscious principles. They don't follow a single look or methodology. Over 50% of Gen Z, which is this younger generation, that's how it's being referred to in the US, state knowing a brand is socially conscious influences purchase decisions. And I will give you an example. This is Baba. It's a high-end Spanish knitwear brand that makes like deceptively simple sweaters, completely vertically integrated in Spain, from start to finish, from like, sheep to sweater. And it also has an integrated donation component for their samples. So they tout a lot of their transparency on their website. It's a pretty youthful brand. Next trend, minimalism. This is the idea that less is more, and that there's such a thing as thoughtful consumption. This trend encompasses things like Marie Kondo's decluttering ideas, the idea of a capsule wardrobe where you have like only 5 things that you wear and you rotate them in and out and they're of very high quality and it's sort of a mix and match aesthetic. It generally means not a lot of print, so I'm not such a big fan of it because I love me a print. And often people who practice this call themselves curators for no decipherable reason. They actually don't have a degree in curation. It's just like a way of talking about themselves as a consumer that makes them feel better. So you can tell I feel a little sarcastic about this trend. Here's an example of it. This is Artifox's shelf. It's something that this company sells. I know it's not apparel related or textile related, but I thought just to give you an idea of the breadth of these new kinds of trends. It's made for something called shelfies, and that means that you go on Instagram and you post pictures of your shelf with your stuff on it that feels very curated and sort of high-end. Another interesting trend is clean beauty. These are products for the face and body that contain very few or traditionally prepared or raw formulations. This is really driven by wellness trends and environmental concerns. I feel like there are a couple of guides, at least in the US, that really made this trend start to explode. One of them was Goop, which is really personality driven by actress, and whatever she is, Gwyneth Paltrow. And then the other one is a nonprofit group site called Skin Deep, the Environmental Working Group. And they have a scientific approach to ingredient listings. And both of these have really driven consumer decision making. Why am I bringing this up to you? Well, in part, I think that if there was a very serious guide like this for textile production, it might also drive these sorts of consumer choices. Another big trend that I'm seeing, we're seeing, is this artisan trend, which is the marriage of on-trend goods and ethical labor standards, working with local artisans, and older techniques to create modern products. The photograph here is of this brand from Los Angeles called Block Shop that works with Indian wood block textile producers with these highly geometric, sort of graphic textiles and prints. And I'm sure they're going to expand into other things. They do a little bit of clothing as well. Just to back this up a little bit more, because I feel like it's worth slowing down and stopping here on the Artisan Trend, there's a site called The Citizenry, which somehow is constantly in my Instagram feed, advertising to me endlessly. And it marries a direct-to-consumer model with a series of home objects created by artisans and co-ops globally. And their transparency is touted throughout the site. I think this is a way to try to connect consumers into something that feels authentic or important or somehow makes that buying decision feel better. I don't have a good name for this trend, but I love this trend, so I'm going to stop here for a second. I call it the one thing trend. It's a stripped down, direct-to-consumer, e-commerce heavy strategy to sell one item and focus on the quality of that item. This has been extended to things like chocolate, axes, shower curtains. There's one company that just makes a desk. The example here is Zuri. They sell a single dress style, but they do it in a variety of wax prints, which they source in Africa, even though we know most of these wax prints are made in Holland. It's very confused. That part's confusing to me, but Americans don't know. Anyway, they're doing very, very well. They also have a couple of brick and mortar retail stores, and they were touted in the New York Times all on this one dress strategy. The final trend I'd like to talk about is rental clothing. I think this started with a company in the US called Rent the Runway, which really spearheaded the idea for professional women to extend their wardrobes through renting clothing that this place sort of carried. Recently, there's this new player called Nuuly, which is extending this model to a younger demographic on a subscription model. I don't think that clothing is actually that durable for this to be a sustainable, a real thing, but it does extend the life of any given garment. I see a lot of investment money going in the US into this idea. I don't believe it, but you know me, I don't believe anything. So what I'm trying to show you is that there's a hunger for sustainability across a wide range of sectors, and it's part of a much larger trend that has to do with this generational shift. So I walked you through those trends. Now, what does sustainability mean in small-scale production, which is what I do? So I'd like us to get very concrete, come in lower. Look, here we are. Now we're at production. We've talked about consumer trends. We've talked about these macro issues. Now I want to drill us down a little bit further. For sustainability in small-scale production, I think there are the following areas of consideration, roughly. Material choice. What is the fabric substrate you're going to use? What is the process of making that fabric substrate? How much water does it use? I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I know you guys know a lot of this stuff. Just bear with me a little bit. The next consideration would be finishing. Again, how much water is used in softening that fabric? What are the kinds of chemicals you're using? Is there a way to recycle that water back into the process so that you use much less water? Obviously, a lot of people here are doing that, but just to get us all in the same playing field. The idea of labor, an area of consideration is labor, which in a small-scale production doesn't necessarily mean accreditation. It means some sort of transparency so you understand what's happening with the people that you're working with within the factories, and you have some idea that it's ethical and that people are being given a living wage. Another area of consideration is transport. Basically, how much carbon are you using in your designs to get it from, here to there? And then the final consideration is end of life. How much waste are you making? What happens to those textiles after you're done with them? Will they compost? Will they biodegrade? Can you recycle them? What is your footprint like? Okay. Examples. Let's say you want to use a material like cotton. I happen to love cotton. It's wearable, it's biodegradable, and it's over a quarter of the virgin feedstock for apparel. So that's humongous. However, it is water intensive, it is pesticide intensive, and it's an environmentally sensitive crop. So any production change that you can make with cotton makes a difference. For me, for a small-scale producer, examples of sustainability contain some kind of compromise. So you understand that cotton is not maybe the most sustainable crop, so maybe you upcharge a little for a GOTS certification to your buyers. Maybe you blend with a more environmentally friendly substrate like linen. The picture here is of one of my prints, and that's on a cotton linen substrate, which I chose exactly for that reason. It's a compromise, but at a small scale, in small scale production, you don't have that much power, so you do what you can do. Material selection Tencel, which I love. It's an attractive, sustainable fabric. It's biodegradable. It's made from wood pulp. You guys all know this. But the real key is that the process of making it is much less toxic and water intensive than other man-made fabrics. I don't think that, I can't really sell a garment based on its Tencel content, but I try, and I use it. And as the customer becomes more sophisticated, maybe they will understand that a little bit better. Recycled fibers. These are very hard for a small brand like me to find. We don't have the volume needed to forge a relationship, an innovative relationship with a mill to produce this. Mills really drive the innovation here. Sometimes it's hard for us to understand, or hard for me, to understand between the rep and the mill where the innovation is. And then on top, if it's a recycled man-made fiber, it continues to degrade into microplastics. So that's not a plus. I put this image up here for a reason. This is a coat by a brand called Rachel Comey in the US. They're doing terrifically well. It's an interesting collaboration between an Italian mill using Korean feedstock that's made out of recycled water bottles. And I think that kind of marriage of high quality innovation, recycled materials is really promising. Certainly this coat is not inexpensive. And so that sort of glamorizes, and they make a big deal out of this particular fabric substrate when they sell it as being sustainable. Oh yeah, finishing. I think consumer awareness is growing about dyeing, about what azo-free dyeing means. There's sort of a micro-trend going on for natural dyes, for tie-dyes. I feel like maybe smaller brands don't understand how water-intensive their processes are if they're doing that kind of dyeing. All the decisions that we could make is, as a smaller brand, is working with a mill or finisher that respects sort of remediation initiatives, water usage, toxicity, et cetera. Finishing processes like industrial garment washing are notorious places for toxicity and water usage waste. So a small business relies on local laws to minimize this issue. This is why I right now do most of my printing in the US, because I know that even if the water usage is up, the toxicity level of what they're doing is very low. I think if I found a mill able to display best available practices like recycling water, heavy metal-free processes, this would make the choice very easy for me as to who to work with, and I would be happy to pay the upcharge for those technological innovations. With labor, I feel like smaller brands, as I said, are less concerned with accreditation and more open to transparency, just understanding who you're working with and what the conditions are like. This is a printer I work with in the US, in Rhode Island, called Griswold. They do hand silk screening. Their quality is outstanding, and I know them, and I know what's happening in there, and that kind of transparency is very important to a smaller brand. Business practices, I'll just be very brief, because I wanted to get to the point that sustainability is also about how big you are, how much you're making. There is definitely a Goldilocks size, especially in design firms, design brands, where tasks are efficiently managed and human resources are not over or underworked. Just constantly growing is sometimes not actually a sustainable thing, and that's true even for businesses. In terms of schedules and sustainability, right now, buyers are driving the sort of retail buyers are driving this sort of untenable 6-season full collection apparel schedule. The internet is making it harder for stores to draw consumers in to actual brick and mortar stores. And this kind of volatility is leading to this sort of panic where there's even, a demand for more seasons, a sort of on-demand cut and sew production. And I'm not even sure that this reflects consumer desires. This is one of the only apparel trade shows I like, Woman Man. It's a very intimate, sort of relaxed atmosphere. They really highlight the brands that they work with. I think the buyers really like this show a lot. Very low pressure. One in New York, one in Paris. I'm not sure if they have a footprint anyplace else. End of life, as we said, is a consideration. Is the material and what you're using biodegradable? Can you recycle it? Are the buttons plastic? It's like down to the nuts and bolts of it. These create reasons why you choose one material over another. What I'm trying to show is that through simple choices, significant sustainability can be made at any scale, even very small. If you had someone here speaking from a very large brand, they'd have a whole different host of concerns. I'm trying to show you what happens at a very intimate scale. So the question is, how can we work together towards a more sustainable production model at all levels? I think for manufacturers, and I think you've probably heard this throughout this conference, investing in R&D and innovating for green production is really the key. Mills are the ones that innovate. If there were an offer of tiered green packages for brands and designers, that would be great. That might mean that you upcharge a much smaller brand because they're ordering a much smaller volume. You simplify what they're looking at because they don't actually need 1,000 substrates. They're really just looking for 1 or 2. I feel like if mills work with reps and sources to get these options into the hands of designers, like hardworking reps are actually great. It makes it much easier for us to find the textiles here. And I think the question is really, when will manufacturers be out of step with market needs for sustainability? I'm not sure, but I think it's something that should be front of mind. Designers and brands, we are very interested and educated in sustainability. We are the ones who are going to communicate the story to the consumer. Small brands are agile, we're flexible, we appreciate transparency, we don't demand certification. The question is, when will all brands sort of demand sustainability? Large brands are saying 2025. Small brands like myself are doing it right now. It's sort of an inevitability that your customer will want this. I would argue right now that small designers and brands are drivers for this change, and that actually makes us valuable. Retailers, they obviously have a lot of power to reshape production. They are probably your best gauge of what the consumer wants. And the question is, when is the sustainability tipping point for them? Probably 2025. Press and influencers, there are many outlets in the sustainability area. I'm not sure they can cut through the noise of the media landscape to get the message across to consumers. They're often only interested in new tech stories. They're kind of like always looking for that shiny object. Some of the less sexy stuff, that is really what I just talked about with small-scale production, is not of interest to them. And the question is, who will be the trustworthy source for consumers in that area? Consumers have the final say. They have a lot of power. There is what I heard from a lot of people I interviewed before I did this is that there's a lot of sustainability expectation, but sustainability isn't yet driving sales with consumers. It's hard to drive that point home with them. And so the question becomes, when will they demand sustainability? Believe me, as soon as they demand it, everything will instantly change. But for now, I feel like the drivers are actually all the other people in place. Oh, yeah, so wait. Who am I? I'm so glad you asked. My name is Tsia Carson, and I am a designer. Look, here we are. And now we're at me. We did the giant issues, the consumer trends, a lot of wonky stuff about production. Now we're going to talk about me for a little bit, my least favorite subject. For a long time, I ran a design studio that created bespoke, interactive systems. What does that mean? This is my firm. I still do consulting work for it. It's called Flat. It was a full-service design studio, and it focused on the intersection of user interface design, also referred to as UX design, and brand planning. And I bring this up here because what you just saw would be very much like a presentation I might do for a client to sort of explain the terrain to them before starting a job and before working with them, so that we could all be on the same page, and then I could get feedback from them whether or not my assumptions were correct. My clients included banks, they included libraries, social networks, and I did a lot of e-commerce, which is kind of how I got here today. Those clients included the Museum of Modern Art, Deutsche Bank, Red Cross, Macy's, AT&T, the Brooklyn Library, Yale, I don't know. I mean, I ran it for 20 years. I could go on and on. But essentially, people would come to me with like a pile of data, and then I would figure out how to surface that data in the best possible way to their audiences. Sounds easy? Not really easy, actually. On the side, this might help explain who I am. I authored a couple of books that were part of the DIY or do-it-yourself trend in the US. And I ran a alternative crafts site community, which is what the books came out of. I did one for grown adults, and I did one for children. They were moderately successful. They were beautiful, critically acclaimed, but I'm always making things. That's always how I've been. Then one day, I started an apparel label about Hawaii. It's a little hard to explain why I did this, because I am not Hawaiian. I'm a New Yorker. I grew up on the same street my grandmother was born on. On that side of my family, I go back 5 generations in New York City, which in New York City time is a very long time. People often don't believe me. I have to bring out genealogy charts, you know. I love the city. In fact, I love all cities. But when I went to Honolulu, which is the large city in Hawaii, everyone thought I was from there, completely convinced, which was a very strange experience for me. And I had to keep explaining that I didn't go to the school they thought I went to, and I didn't grow up in the neighborhood they thought I grew up in. So I moved there. That's like the short version of that story. It was actually much more complicated than that. So these pictures I'm showing you in between are prints that I make, clothes that I make, shot mostly in Hawaii, because I wanted to contribute to the Hawaiian cultural conversation, which is very rich and deep and multi-layered. So for instance, in this shot, this beach is it looks like any old beach probably to you, but if you are from there, you know this is a very local beach that most tourists don't really go to, in a very specific tourist spot in Oahu, in Honolulu. I also use forms that feel very Hawaiian, and I choose to style what I do in ways with very traditional Hawaiian things like leis, rainbows, these fans, but even the slippers, the shoes that she's wearing, anyone from Hawaii would know exactly what drugstore those came from. So it gets very specific. It looks casual. It is not casual. I love a big print. I've been extending it to things like bathing suits, which you definitely need in Hawaii. And just to kind of show you how the sausage gets made, which I don't know if that's a metaphor that you use here. These are behind the scenes of just sort of the way that we do shoots there. It's a very small team. I work generally with the same people over and over again. This is shot in a beautiful brutalist building in downtown Honolulu. It's a court building, actually. Again, this is shot in New York, but also with a very small team, very intimate. And again, just to show you, there's not like 50,000 people working with me. It's really me and very small teams I put together. You can see here, these were shot in downtown Honolulu, and those are crown flower leis. And these fans, it all reads as very particular to the place. A sense of place is very important there. But this is the image that most people have of Hawaii, probably. So I'm going to stop here just for a second to say, it really looks like this. The ocean really is this color. People really are surfing. That really is an extinct volcano in the background. It is a completely magical environment. What I don't have is a slide to explain how complex it is there culturally. So I'm going to try to do that with a few other slides. These were taken at a very popular part of the beach I just showed you in that picture. You can see that she is standing in front of a building. This building is condemned. It's been condemned forever. It's right on the ocean. I cannot explain to you why. It's almost falling down. This is a weed. You cannot eat it. I tried. This is my daughter skateboarding. This is the neighborhood we lived in. There was a rainbow like this every single afternoon, all the time, like magic. This is the beach access to Obama's favorite beach. I wanted to show you this just to show you that it's not beautiful all the way through. It's a very, I mean, that's not nice, right? Anyway, this is a fabulous beach, though. And this is another of my series of photographs for my clothes that just shows you kind of what downtown Honolulu feels like. And it's not usually a place that people would choose to show. The history of fashion there is also very complex. Let me give you an example of that, which is kind of fun, the holoku dress. Okay, so you're in the 1800s. These missionaries from Boston come to Hawaii. They're not actually very fashionable. They're wearing this older French court dress that contains this Watteau pleating down the back. The Hawaiians love it. They think it's amazing. They demand that dresses be made with this out-of-fashion Watteau pleating. This is a holoku dress worn by the last princess of Hawaii. These are some pictures of the holoku as translated. This would be, obviously, this black and white picture is Victorian era, and these sketches are probably 60 sketches, so it changes into like sort of a hostess party dress. It's misidentified as a muumuu. This is a holoku, just so we get those terms straight. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Alfred Shaheen, which might explain a little bit of my connection there. So Alfred Shaheen ran a very successful Hawaiian apparel studio. He was Hawaiian. He had his own textile printing mill. His clothes are fabulous. And his main, like his head of seamstress apparel, some of his textile designers were all from New York. So even from the sort of beginning of the commercialization of this sort of dress, there was a crossover to the mainland, to New York. The other thing I need to mention to you that distinguishes aloha wear Hawaiian clothes is this large print. And there's an apocryphal story that at some point during World War II, they couldn't get anything but upholstery fabric, which has a much larger repeat on it. And they just started making clothing out of those upholstery fabrics. And that led to the birth of this sort of very large-scale repeat that's very Hawaiian, that I love. So this is an example of sort of the print scale from the sort of high moment of Hawaiian fashion in the 1960s. This is what happened to the holoku in the 60s. You can see these insane colorways, sort of lush choice of fabrics. So I thought about that, and I took like the principles of the large-scale print, but I modernized it, sort of made the repeats big, but made them much more abstract, much more graphic, much less 60s. And then I took this form that's very evocative there for a number of reasons, and I shortened it, reweighted it, and then put one of my modern prints on it. The question I got asked a lot when I was there was, how does a haole? Haole is a Hawaiian pidgin term for a person of European descent. It's not a nice word. How does a haole like you know how to make clothes like this? Well, I can't say. I've always loved these clothes. They came to the mainland. There were people involved in New York in the Hawaiian apparel scene. They just resonated with me. And you can see the kind of research I do when I make something. That's how a haole makes these kinds of clothes. The press reaction was sort of phenomenal, however. People went nuts in my first year. I was voted best local prints, ironic for a New Yorker, in Honolulu Magazine, which is sort of the magazine that people read there. I got a lot of press in Japanese magazines because there's a big Japan-Hawaii crossover, and other Hawaiian press clips. People were posting pictures on Instagram that were super cute. I mean, it's been nothing but fun. And I think that the only other thing I want to say about this is that there's a Hawaiian concept called pono. It's hard to translate, but it covers sort of a moral worldview of being proper or righteous or upright. And I feel like, in my case, my brand's trying to be sustainable and also reviving these old dress forms and modernizing them aligns with this worldview. I'm always trying to be pono with what I do with the brand. I knew Hawaii through its clothes, and it embraced me as its own. Okay, but now back on planet Earth, when I actually have to produce this stuff, I had all kinds of production issues, which I think map to anybody in a small-scale scenario, not just me. I decided to manufacture in the US because it gave me the most agility, transparency about what was going on. Manufacturing in the US, at least the kind that I want to do, fairly moribund, hard to find vendors. There was a lot of issues with quality control and consistency. The scaling for like sourcing for someone of my scale to find like a beautiful fabric substrate and then to print beautifully on it was actually very hard, is very hard to do in the US. Other issues were I could never, ever sync my market weeks for apparel buyers with my print production. It is a constant, in part it's because I'm so small, but they never sync up, and so my samples are never ready, basically, and I'm always playing catch up. And then the wholesale seasonal schedules are out of control, and there's no way for a small brand like mine to keep up with them, so I basically just sell wholesale 1 season a year instead of 6. And then consumers have these kind of fast fashion expectations, which just means that they expect this garment that was made so carefully and ethically and sustainably to somehow be profoundly cheap. And so I'm always coming up against this and having to educate a lot of my customers and to reduce that expectation. I'm always asking people to buy less. So why should any of you here bother with such small clients? Because as you can see, I am a pain to work with. I'm very exacting. I'm not doing a huge amount of volume. Now we're at you. See? Global trends, global issues, consumer trends, production issues, me, you. How I think we could work together? I mean, small brands, it's like transparency versus accreditation. When you're working with a small brand, we just want to know what's going on. We don't need some kind of accreditation that costs the mill $1 zillion to do and upkeep. It's of no interest. And that's because relationships are sort of everything. I like to know who I'm working with. I like to be able to talk to them and understand their perspective and forge sort of long-term relationships. I did that in my design consulting business, and I do that now. I feel like just a little effort on targeted outreach to small brands would yield a giant result. And why would you do all this? Well, I feel like it's a diversification strategy that maybe you have 10 small brands, but one sustainable brands like me, but 1 or 2 ends up actually becoming and growing into a huge brand. So you have to figure out how much risk, how much time you're willing to put in. For a small brand, we just need like kind of a specialized offering. We don't need everything. We need maybe 3 or 4 things. So it's a very small investment on a mill's part. There could be an idea for like aggregation strategies, and by that I mean mills get together, they make a package, they upcharge the hell out of smaller brands, but they provide fabric substrates, printing that works for a smaller brand and works for the mill financially. The only other thing I would say that no one mentioned this to me when I was sort of talking to other small brands and people I know in the apparel industry and the textile industry. But man, if there was any way that I could actually get matching cycles so that my market cycles and my print cycles were not so out of sync, that would do a world of good for my sales. But in the end, like, you all probably have the best ideas because you are the experts in the field. I'm just coming at this from my limited perspective. So my final thoughts on this is that I really feel like sustainability is a growth sector, both for small-scale and large-scale producers. I think the trends all point to it. I think people are making promises now about 2025 that they are not going to be able to walk back. I feel like small clients like myself allow you to diversify in what is a very fluid and sort of volatile market, and that we can be very good partners to you. I feel like, and this is a strange thing to say, but that some of the innovation at the mill level should maybe involve consumer research. And I don't know exactly how that would work, but I feel like you may not be getting the best intel on where you should innovate based on your clients as a mill. In the end, the consumer is the one who's buying the very end product, and I don't think that they're being listened to closely and they're not being spoken to in an articulate manner, especially about sustainability. And since I think that designers right now are really driving this change, I would just ask to please make it easier for us to do this in whatever way that is financially viable for you, because we are interested in partnerships. I feel like I'm talking for many people, but I sort of am. I did interview a bunch of other small designers. There's lots of us in the US, and they all talked about sustainability as this real driver of their decision-making process. I will mispronounce this. I'm apologizing in advance. Teşekkür ederim. If anybody has questions,
yeah. Is there any questions? Sorusu olan varsa alabiliriz. I think no. Thank you for a great presentation. We have a present for you now. Yeah. Ödül takdimi için UTİP Yönetim Kurulu üyesi Sayın Aslı Türk'ün Karaçor'u sahneye davet edebilir miyiz? Alkışlarınızla lütfen. Can you come here?
Follow you. Oh my God. Nice to meet you. Thank you so much. It's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you again. Büyük bir alkış alalım Tsia Carson için.
Thank you.